Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us on this day, which is admittedly a little bit unusual given a lot of the international news, like Kenitra was so graciously, telling us about. Thank you again to Kenitra for putting us all together, and to the SMU Deason Center for sponsoring this webinar and getting us all together to be able to discuss this today. I'm really excited and honored to be able to introduce our panelists for today for our Star Justice series, Access to Justice for People of Color in Star Spaces. We've got an incredible panel. I am so thrilled. I know that you're going to learn so much from them. So I'd like to start by making introductions. And I'll start with Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, who is a nationally recognized leader in police community relations and an authority on urban policing, diversity issues in criminal justice, race and crime, and criminal justice systems. He served for 14 years in the Suffolk County, and that's in Massachusetts, Sheriff's Department, working in policing, corrections, and the courts, which he says has shaped his approach to teaching, research, and training of police commanders and officers. He's widely published and has recently authored the book Massachusetts' Criminal Justice System. And his book chapters include Black Lives Matter, The Watchdog for the Criminal Justice System in Appearance, Bias, and Crime, and Does Police Discretion Help or Harm Our Criminal Justice System in Crime and Criminal Justice Concepts and Controversies. His other publications include Race and Geography and Juvenile Justice, an exploration of the liberation hypothesis in race and justice, Racial Disparities in Juvenile Court Outcomes, a test of the liberation hypothesis in the Journal of Ethnicity and Criminal Justice, Light Blue versus Dark Blue, Attitude Differences in Quality of Life Policing in the Journal of Ethnicity and Criminal Justice, and Minority Threat Hypothesis and the Workload Hypothesis, a community-level examination of lenient policing in high crime communities in Criminal Justice Studies, a critical journal of crime, law, and society. He received his PhD in sociology from Northeastern University, his master's in applied sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and his bachelor's in sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. We're also joined by Professor Jacqueline Bridgman, who is a member of the University of Wyoming College of Law faculty and adjunct faculty in the African American and Diaspora Studies department since 2002. She became Associate Dean of Academic Affairs for the College of Law in October 2010. Was named Associate Dean of Program Development and Kepler Professor of Law in August 2013. She was appointed Interim Dean of the College of Law in November of 2013 and served in that capacity until June of 2015. So on July 1st, 2017, she became the interim and inaugural director of the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice in the College of Arts and Sciences. During her career, she's taught employment law, sports law and entertainment law, family law, torts, legal writing, and has conducted the College of Law's Academic Achievement Program. So it sounds like Professor Bridgman could run a whole law school on her own, given all the classes that she's taught. And I very much admire that. She's also taught African Americans in the law and Black politics in the African American Diaspora Studies Program. And Professor Bridgman received the John P. Elbidgen Meritorious Classroom Teaching Award in 2008. I was named the College of Law's Outstanding Faculty Member for 2004 through 2005, and 2013 to 2014. And in 2014, she was recognized as a Woman of Distinction by the University of Wyoming Women's Leadership Conference. Professor Bridgman is also the magistrate judge for the Albany County Integrated Treatment Program, which is the juvenile drug court in Wyoming. So before getting to the University of Wyoming, she was an associate attorney at the Los Angeles law firm of Curale, Delaverson, Hirschfield, Kramer, and Sloan, and Loeb, where she specialized in a wide range of labor and employment matters. She received her Bachelor's of Arts degree with honors from Stanford University, and she got her JD from the University of Chicago. Professor Bridgman's scholarly writing has been in the areas of race, gender, education, politics, family, and sports. We're also joined by Dr. Robert Brown today, who is a professor and chair of, department, wow. I always forget this. He actually is like the department chair of so much. And I always stumble on this because it's exhausting, frankly. I'm like, that can't be when I look at it. But he is a professor. He's the chair of the Department of Criminal Justice and the Department of Social Sciences at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. So I see that and I'm like, wait, how can someone do that? And yet he does it. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science from Hampton University, his master's degree in criminology with a specialization in corrections from Indiana State University, and he earned his doctorate in criminal justice with a specialization in policing from the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Brown has worked as a sentencing mitigation specialist for the nonprofit Maryland-based National Center on Institutions and Alternatives, coordinating offender-specific rehabilitation, parole, and supervision plans for juvenile adult offenders at the state and federal levels. And his research focuses on street-level interactions between police officers and the public, like citations and arrests and use of force, misdemeanor justice and the processing of low-level offenses, fear of crime, alternatives to incarceration, and the influence of race and gender on criminal justice processing. Dr. Brown's work has been published in Justice Quarterly, Policing, an International Journal of Police Strategies and Management, Criminal Justice and Behavior, Race and Justice, and the Du Bois Review, Social Science Research on Race. So this is an outstanding panel that we have here. I am so thrilled to be able to have the chance to have this discussion with them and this conversation with them today. As you heard earlier, I'm Maybell Romero. I'm the Felder Fayard Associate Professor of Law at Tulane University, and I write in specifically rural criminal justice. I do a bit in prosecutorial ethics, specifically looking at rural prosecutors. I've also written a bit on communities of color in the rural regions of the United States and their interactions with the criminal legal system as well. So I'm thrilled to be here with you. So for this conversation today, I really want to keep it pretty free flowing. We're going to be avoiding the usual sort of panel format that you might see where everyone has a set presentation and then we have a Q&A and then another set presentation. Really, I want to have like a great conversation with everyone today, and we'll open it up to Q&A as the hour goes on. But really what I want to start with was just this really sort of foundational question, because I want to hear more about everyone's work. I know a little bit about it already, which is why I know that everyone else will be excited to hear about it. But our theme for today, as everyone knows, is discussing access to justice for people of color in small, tribal, and rural spaces. So what I'd love to hear is how what everyone's current projects and positions that they're in at their respective schools, how that exactly shapes their understanding of our theme today and how that relates to what we're talking about today. So we could go in alphabetical order, I guess. So let's start with Dr. Boyd.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. And let me just say that I'm the Stewart Professor of Criminal Justice and Community Policing at the University of New Haven. And I spent the first part of my career doing a lot of research. The second part of my career, I spent translating research into practice. So I do a lot of police training across the country. On a typical non-COVID year, I do about 250 hours of training of police across the country. And that roughly translates to about an 8-week police academy. So I spend a lot of time, obviously, in urban settings, but we also have to realize that the vast majority of police departments in this country have less than 10 officers. So over the last few years, I've been spending time in rural communities. When I was at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, I did a lot of police training on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which is pretty rural, and Dr. Brown's going to talk about that. I also have a contract, a multi-year contract. I'm doing a lot of training up in the Adirondacks, the far north country in New York. And urban policing and rural policing are very, very, very different, and they need to be approached as such. So a lot of what I'm doing now is just translating the excellent research that's out there into practice, because I found a lot of the research that's out there is not easily digestible by the people doing the job. So I spend a lot of time trying to make it accessible and try to help them understand best practices of the research that's actually happening.
Great, thank you so much. Professor Bridgman, how does your work relate to our topic for today? I know that, at one point we were talking, we had a prep call and you're like, well, I'm not sure that this is directly related to criminal justice. And I think we're going to be talking about a lot of things that go beyond what our usual understandings with regard to criminal justice are too, but you have such an amazing variety of experience, I think is really relevant to this.
Yeah, you'll notice in that list of courses, criminal justice was not one of those, but as we talked about, I think I come to this more from the perspective of access to justice. Wyoming, as we like to say, is a small town as a state with long streets, right? So it's really small. And so everyone has to kind of pitch in and do the work. And so I come at this from a number of places. One is in my role as director of our School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice. So within that, we have a rural Black Studies Center and we have a rural social justice center. And right now, our rural social justice center in particular is focused on university community partnerships, several of which are centered on issues of access to justice around our state and really wholesale legal reform across the state as well. So we're at the beginning of a lot of those conversations. I've also served for several years on what's called our Equal Justice Wyoming board. And so that group actually works on delivering access to justice in real time. So, you know, in places where there are no attorneys, how do we get people the opportunity to speak with an attorney with whatever their issue might be, or how do we get them access to courts? And so I've been involved with those initiatives for a number of years. And then the third place where my work intersects in this area is through my work as the magistrate judge for our juvenile drug court. Right. And so we do a lot of justice reform efforts there. And right now we're one of only 2 juvenile drug courts in the state, and we're still fairly new. So we're having conversations, even a conference this May, where we're talking about how we can spread the ability to have those courts in more places, which is hard to do when you've got small spaces. So I guess in several different ways. I certainly do work on access to justice, although it doesn't tend to be as criminal focused as my fellow panelists.
Fantastic, thank you. Dr. Brown, I'd love to hear more about what your scholarship, how it intersects with our topic for today and how it shapes your understanding of access to justice for people of color in the rural United States.
Thank you for allowing me to be here and a part of this great panel. Not necessarily as the most thought out plan, I ended up developing a career where I've been able to work in both front end, middle, and back end parts of criminal justice. I started off focusing on corrections, and my earliest research activities involved looking at community policing and approaches to community policing in rural Midwestern Indiana areas. After I got my master's degree with a specialization in corrections, I was fortunate enough to work for a not-for-profit organization, the National Center on Institutions and Alternatives, where I did a lot of work on parole planning, sentencing mitigation, reverse waiver reports for juveniles. And that involved going to a lot of prisons to interview clients. And many of those prisons were in very rural areas. So I started to develop an understanding and appreciation of, while my clients may have been based or their offenses occurred in very urban areas, they were housed, and I would argue displaced, to very rural areas, which made it challenging for them to have strong or a certain type of legal representation, challenging for them to have frequent contact with their families and loved ones. That created challenges for their reintegration back in their communities. So I started to have a deeper appreciation of urban versus non-urban, or urban versus rural issues going back that far. Eventually, I became a policing scholar, and I've done research related to small data collection and research related to large and small police departments. And that has informed my teaching. I'm fundamentally an academic, and I have focused a lot of my career on preparing the next generation of legal scholars and the next generation of criminal justice practitioners. And one of the things that has been fundamental to my teaching is getting people to understand how government works in our country, and really helping people understand criminal justice at the county level and at the city level, and trying to break misconceptions that criminal justice is all about what happens in Chicago, in New York, and in Los Angeles, particularly as it relates to TV shows about criminal justice in Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles. And helping students understand that many of the challenges we face in criminal justice are a function of resources and politics at the local level.
Thank you so much. And we're going to get to those issues with regard to, I think, resources and politics and everything, but I'm going to start with perhaps an even broader sort of framing question, because I was talking about, I was talking up this panel to, you know, a friend at a different law school recently, and I was like, okay, I'm going to be moderating this awesome panel with these amazing scholars with regard to access to justice for people of color in, you know, rural spaces, in these star spaces. And they're like, well, there are people of color in these star spaces. What are you talking about? And I feel like you watch, you know, you watch TV, you watch the news, you read about things, and there's this sort of long-standing narrative that we've got like these two Americas, and we talk about this urban-rural divide. And I feel like there's this sort of understanding that, okay, if you're in an urban space, if you're in a big city, New York, Los Angeles, what have you, you have a much more cosmopolitan atmosphere. You have, you know, more, you know, people are more successful, but they also happen to be more liberal, but also they happen to be much more diverse. And there's this understanding that, okay, you get into the rural reaches of the country, it's going to be white, it's going to be conservative, it's going to be constantly like economic decline. And it's interesting to see that sort of schism in people's understanding of these geographies. So I'm wondering if you all could speak to whether this is correct and what you think this narrative is missing. I'm wondering if there's anyone who wants to like chip in on that first.
Yeah, I'll jump in first. The one thing I can say, having done training all over the country, that rural America is not a monolith. I definitely agree there are two Americas, at least, depending on if you look at things on the horizontal racial plane, or if you look on the vertical economic plane. You know, I'll give either, you know, when we talk about intersectionality. But when we talk about race and rural communities, I would say that the line of demarcation would be the Mason-Dixon line, because the thing that I found is rural communities north of the Mason-Dixon line, or in the Midwest, or even in the, you know, upper, you know, Pacific region, tend to be more white. But I noticed in the South and in the Bible Belt, the vast majority of rural people I found tend to be Black. So the line of demarcation, I would say, is North versus South more than anything else when we talk about race in rural communities.
Anyone else wanted to jump in on this?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this. This is, of course, one of the things I find most frustrating being a person in those rural communities. So I've lived in Wyoming since I was 6, although I left for a time when I went to college. And it's interesting to me to hear these things for a whole host of reasons. You know, as Dr. Boyd was saying, rural spaces are not monolithic. You know, that essentialist sort of labeling, I think, is really problematic for a whole host of reasons. You know, just as all conservatives aren't made the same, right? And so one of the things I think is interesting is we'll compare rural spaces to urban spaces, but not necessarily rural spaces to themselves. And so while several rural spaces, as he's saying, in certain parts of the country, but certainly not all parts of the country, may be more white. If you look at my state, it's much more racially diverse than it was 10, 15, even 20 years ago, right? So the changing demographics across the country happen across the country, even in these rural spaces. And then conservatism, however that's labeled, plays out differently. You know, so if you look on a lot of polls or however they calculate that, Wyoming would be considered one of the reddest states in the country. Yet we have probably one of the most progressive funding systems for education and spend more on public education per student than pretty much anywhere else in the country. You know, we have a great public education system, not just K through 12, but for higher education too. We also have, although we've got a couple bills that are pending, but one of the most accessible voting systems too. It is one of the easiest states to vote, no matter where you live in the country. And so I think a lot of those stereotypes and the divisiveness that happens come because we do that monolithic essentialist thinking, which in my experience, of course, just isn't true and is really problematic, I think, in a lot of ways.
Dr. Brandon, do you have anything else to add to this?
I'd just like to add, we terrible job of discussing race, ethnicity. We do a terrible job of focusing on criminal justice with a big city bias. We want to talk about two worlds. I've been a part of many discussions where we split the country in half, and that half is coastal. That there's the East Coast and the West Coast. So we really ignore the true nature, the true makeup of our country. And what we do poorly when it comes to urban spaces, we do an even worse job when it comes to trying to recognize and understand rural spaces. I think that the intersection of geography and economics, how poverty out and how we look at government and funding, what Lorenzo and Jacqueline have talked about, those issues become even more complex in rural spaces. And great that we're trying to talk about this right now, because we tend to do such a bad job of it. The bad job being, first, we don't talk about it. And when we do talk about it, we still try to simplify it, as if we have to create some mold of what rural places look like. And excited.
And that's something I think gets really lost in a lot of the discussions where we just polarize everything so much and essentialize everything, like Professor Bridgman was saying, and that I think we lose a lot of the sort of individuality of each rural place, right, when we do that. And I feel like I've spoken to a lot of people who seem to think that, one rural place is fungible with another, but each rural place is going to be very different, right? Rural Wyoming is not going to look the same as rural, Maryland, or, any place, in the South or anything. More my experiences in Northern Utah, and in, growing up around Los Angeles. So when I think of rural, I think of the rural Southwest, which is largely, Latinx. And the populations are growing and everything, and it's interesting to see what is spurring that and how people still assume that that's all very white and very monolithic and very conservative, whatever that happens to mean. So I appreciate hearing everyone's thoughts with regard to what exactly we're missing and the things that we're not engaging with that we should be doing a bit better. What are some of the biggest challenges that you can see right now, or at least forecast in future, when it comes to these issues of access to justice for rural people of color in particular? Because we started talking a little bit about funding and resourcing and everything, and I know that's a really big challenge. I'm sure everyone else who's joining us is probably facing themselves.
I think one of the issues that we have is that we tend to ignore, when we talk about rural spaces, we tend to ignore First Nation folks. We tend to ignore Indigenous people here. And then when we do decide to talk about it, we'll just relegate them to tribal communities or tribal law and totally ignore the fact that they're as intertwined in American culture as anyone. So access, we have to have access to the law at a level where people can actually access the law. Because again, we have this big city bias, as Dr. Brown was talking about, and we tend to view criminal justice from that lens, and everything else is relegated as something different. If we can kind of refocus on a lot of the stuff, because in rural communities, they spend more time talking about land than they do in urban communities, real property, as opposed to, smaller things that you buy and have. So there's a whole lot of other stuff. And again, when we try to paint all things Americana, we are missing the very fabric of our nation and the things that make us special. But we also, and I'm going to keep going back to it, we have a bifurcated system based on economics. And when I talk about issues of justice in the classroom, I always start off by asking people, what is justice? And it's funny, whether I'm training police or talking to graduate students, most people said that they've never been asked what justice is or have a handle on justice. And I think that's where we need to start. what is actual justice? And then once we determine that, how is it meted out? Because when people tell me that there's a larger percentage of people of color incarcerated than white, agreed, but the vast majority of people that are incarcerated are at or below the poverty line. We tend not to incarcerate affluent people nearly at the same level. We don't execute affluent people. And in this country, we're okay apparently with executing children and people with mental disabilities. But the common denominator is lack of resource. It's, we need to bring resource into a lot of these poorer communities. And at a national level, when we talk resource, we tend to funnel our resources into major metropolitan areas, unfortunately, to the demise of a lot of our rural communities.
Professor Bridgman or Dr. Brown, do you have anything else to add to what Dr. Boyd was saying here? Because I think that, oh, sorry, please, go ahead.
No, I was having trouble with my mute button, sorry.
No, I
think
totally
one thing I would add too to what Dr. Boyd said, and I agree with that. I think a lot of it really is a poverty issue. At least that's what I see. When I look at the kids that end up in our juvenile court, that has a lot to do with social class. And to the extent that correlates with race, that's an issue too. And then, we've got problems of cultural competency and that sort of thing. But the other thing I found, and a recent experience where we've had to go back to our federal funders for that court and rework what our federal grant looks like, is even when some of those urban resources will come into rural communities, they're still done with an urban lens, right? And so they aren't tailored to a situation with smaller populations or a situation like ours where the resources you may need to access are an hour or 2 hours away from where you live. That's just not even on the radar screen. So for example, in our grant, they expected that we would have 15 kids in the court, and in our town, we don't hardly have 15 kids on probation, let alone with serious enough drug problems. And so we've had to go back, and they've been great at working with us. But I think that's one other issue. There's a lack of resources, and then the resources you have oftentimes don't work that well or aren't made or haven't been thought through in that different space because there's such an urban bias. I think when we think about those things, and certainly with respect to people of color as well.
Yeah, things don't scale quite in the same way, do they? Where it's like, okay, we're going to take this and foist it on you, and your problems must look exactly like our problems. And what I'm wondering is, have any of the rest of you three on the panel, have any of you run into issues with regard to trying to, say, apply for a grant or something like that, and there have been issues with trying to figure out, okay, what exactly does rural mean? Or what is that definition? And because I've been hearing really interesting stories about, okay, this grant will use this definition of rural, maybe we don't qualify for that because we're too close to a big city, or maybe there's an issue with population density. I'd love to hear your experiences in that sense when we're talking about trying to find remedies to being under-resourced.
One of the things I like to do is I like to lay out a geographic area, that I'd like to do the research in, and then I offer the definition of rural and then hand that to them. And I'm not a big fan of letting other people identify or define the stuff that I'm doing. So I pick a geographic area, part of a state, part of a county, and then I tell them, this is rural, this is what I'm working on, and these are the reasons. And I tend to be pretty successful when I do it that way.
I've witnessed jurisdictions facing a very broad challenge when it comes to grant writing, pursuing grants. They are used to trying to pursue grants that are clearly targeted for large jurisdictions. They're clearly favored toward people who can service or projects that can service a large number of people. And they're not going to have the infamous 15 kids that are needed to make that count. And they're also trying to pursue funding opportunities that are unique to smaller jurisdictions, yet they don't have the grant writing expertise to be successful in getting those grants. So the grants that are maybe more targeted or specific for them, they don't have the expertise, and they're not able to really compete with jurisdictions that have dedicated grant writers, professional grant writers. There's also, I would be surprised if others have not witnessed this. Once you get funded, you're in the loop, and it's easier to get the next grant and the next grant. So when you have a jurisdiction that's never been funded, that's trying to break into a funding cycle, and they do not have the template to borrow from, and we're not talking the template, the guidance that an RFP gives you. We're talking you have templates of successfully funded grants that you can build upon. When you have jurisdictions that do not have that, they experience challenges with getting funding. And that problem, that is a challenge for urban criminal justice service providers. It's worse for rural or small criminal justice providers.
Thank you. And I imagine, Professor Bridgman, you see that those sorts of challenges play out in your juvenile drug court too, when it comes to challenges with finding service providers, or even being able to get, I would imagine, kids to their service providers if you're having to traverse long distances and the like. Could you speak just more with regard to some of the challenges with regard to that, this juvenile drug court that you have running, funding wise, logistic wise, finding service providers even?
Yeah, it's challenges all over the place. So one of our biggest issues, as Dr. Brown alluded to, right, is finding people with the right expertise for all the things you need. Right now, our biggest issue is treatment providers, ones that can work with kids, ones that can deal with serious drug abuse issues. We've got like about 3 of those in our town, and we're doing better than most of the places around the state. So those are just the sheer lack of professional providers, and then they're all busy at different levels is an issue. And then the other thing that I think happens in our court is because we're so small and there's so much going on, people have to wear several hats, right? So I do juvenile court in addition to running an entire school for our university, right? And so you're pulled in a lot of different places. And so sometimes I think there are things we would develop even when people have expertise that we can't, just because you can't dedicate all of your time just to drug court, or, almost everyone on our team does that as part of another job they also do for that reason. And then lack of attorneys, lack of knowledge about, a lot of basic things happens quite a bit. So that educational piece is difficult for us. I think when we were setting up this panel, someone referred to it as legal deserts to a certain extent, right? And that, I think, is very true where we are. We have whole communities that don't have an attorney, and then when they're small, that attorney may have 5 conflicts of interest, right, for your particular case or your particular issue. And so, yeah, we deal with those kinds of problems all the time.
And those legal deserts are really hard to remedy, aren't they? In that you have attorneys who, I don't necessarily think that they're trying to do these jobs in a sort of nefarious, like, I'm not going to put in the time that I should, into whatever contract I might have to represent kids in court or represent criminal defendants in court. But there isn't necessarily enough work for them to build a full-time job out of it. So they have to go and, do some work on the side in family law or something, and they might have, conflicts that arise from there. And that's a really difficult thing, I think, for, everyone, let alone people of color in these rural spaces. How exactly do we get them the attorneys that they need to be able to get access to the courts, if not necessarily justice? So has anyone seen any interesting sort of strides toward remedying that issue when it comes to fixing this legal desert, or at least being able to put some patches on this sort of like, I remember an article describing it as a very thin quilt of, attorneys out there that kind of hold a network together, but sometimes there are holes. And how do we get people who are in that hole, the representation that they need? I'd be curious to hear if anyone's familiar with any efforts to remedying that.
One of the things that I noticed is there is a brain drain in a lot of rural areas. So I think the thing that's more unusual is somebody leaving rural Wyoming, going to Stanford and returning to Wyoming. And I applaud that. A lot of times people will leave a rural area, get a taste of urban living, faster life, more money, more, and then decide that they want to build a different life for themselves and their families. And the whole lower eastern shore of Maryland, there are only 2 attorneys of color of the whole lower eastern shore. And those attorneys, as you alluded to, they do criminal, they do probate, they do family. So they need to be jacks of all trades. But there's a lot of people who go to attorneys that want attorneys that look like them. And there are a lot of legal deserts out there. We need to make it more attractive for people to come back and give back. But again, folks are built differently sometimes once they leave and spend 4 years undergrad and then 3 years in law school. So 7 years you've been out of your community. Sometimes it's hard to go back. So I don't know what a remedy is. I do understand the reason that it's a problem, but I don't necessarily have a fix for it.
I appreciate that forthrightness. This is a hard problem. It's a really difficult one. And when we're specifically thinking about attorneys, you go to law school, you spend a lot of money on that. You worry potentially about going back to, I think, sometimes a rural place because you might not be able to make the salary that you need to be able to sustain the lifestyle that you need to pay back your loans, for example, or something like that. And I think that's a really big problem, especially for students of color who generally do have to rely more on financial aid and everything, where it makes it a lot more difficult, if they want to return home to be able to do that. I believe that, you could see, I think Illinois is starting to do a few things with regard to establishing rural fellowships for students who choose to go out and practice in rural reaches of Illinois. They've started to try to match people with older practitioners who might be retiring, who need to figure out, okay, what do I do with my practice? Perhaps I can hand this off to someone who's interested in coming and taking it over. So those are, I think, really interesting remedies. I don't know if anyone else had anything with regard to, potentially bouncing around ideas as to how we go about fixing this, legal desert, at least places to start, especially for rural people of color.
I can speak to some of the things. Oh, sorry, Dr. That we've done in our state, right? Because we have this problem all the time. And so through that board that I'm on, Equal Justice Wyoming, what we did, so going back to that prior discussion about conservative states, right? One of the things that we've done is through some of our fees and things that we've collected is that group, Equal Justice Wyoming, has about $2 million that they spend every year, every biennium. And that's to set up different things to allow access to justice, right? And that comes out of our state legislature, part of an appropriation. And we've done a number of things. So I think you have to be a little bit innovative and think differently. So we think of it as a statewide problem rather than a singular community problem. And so we have hotlines that people can call. And then if they have a bigger legal issue that can't be addressed, like we do a lot of limited scope representation, for example, we'll try to hook them up with attorneys in different parts of the state that could service their needs. Through a grant making process in that group, we will, we've set up people to do work, especially with low income people, and to meet their needs, although most of it's non-criminal, in different parts of the state, right? And we target the legal desert parts of the state, and we will work with local nonprofits and things to set up legal services that at least are available part of the week or part of the time, or that you can access by going to the courts. And so we've done some sort of out of the box things and funded it that way. It's not perfect, but it helps. But I think solving that problem outside of just that real small rural community and thinking of it as a statewide problem has helped us quite a bit.
Amazing, thank you. And Dr. Brown, did you have something to add?
I think that we need to pursue some different approaches when it comes to higher education, at least higher education in criminal justice. You do not have to have an undergraduate degree in criminal justice to go on to law school. It's surely not the de facto major for law school, even though there are some folks who think that it is the appropriate degree. With that said, we tend to see a lot of students who have law school aspirations, major in criminal justice or political science. And I can tell you, at least on the criminal justice side, and as a former department chair, Lorenzo can affirm this. When we look at criminal justice core curriculum, and you see introduction to criminal justice, you see introduction to courts, introduction to law enforcement, introduction to corrections, you might as well say introduction to urban criminal justice, introduction to urban law enforcement, urban courts, and corrections with a focus on urban areas. It is the default. I bring that up because I can tell you, in doing research on criminal justice undergraduate and graduate curriculums, I have yet to see a rural justice, a course entitled Rural Justice, in any criminal justice core, undergraduate or graduate, and only a speck here and there of it being even an elective course. So when you have degree programs that fundamentally do not teach about rural justice issues, it's not that surprising that people who end up getting degrees in criminal justice and then jobs in criminal justice don't think about criminal justice outside of urban centers. And while, as I noted early in this discussion, in my teaching, I try to get students to think about a broader field and think about geography. I'll make a comparison to ethics. We can say in criminal justice that we talk about ethical issues throughout courses, and there's a difference between that and having an ethics course, a course in ethics that students have to take. And it's been well recognized in our discipline that a specific course about ethics is necessary, just like specific courses on race, ethnicity, and gender are important, because saying that we infuse it or integrate it throughout the curriculum is not enough. Well, we need to reevaluate our academic programs and think about this issue of rural versus urban criminal justice.
Thank you. And I think Dr. Boyd, did you have something to add too?
Yeah, we also have to remove the stigma of rural America, because we teach people that moving to the big city is what you're supposed to do. And many times there's this false narrative of people in rural areas being country bumpkins, and they're not sophisticated and they're not smart. And we have to teach folks that even though people in rural areas may speak slow, they don't think slow. So we have to change that whole narrative. And I think that's part of the problem, because in media and news, we just have this negative light on rural areas. And we need to fix that, because some of our greatest minds, some of our greatest thinkers started in rural areas and moved into other areas. So we need to kind of help romanticize that again.
And I think there's something to be said too about the way that I think a lot of people in urban centers, excuse me, think about, rural labor to some extent. They think about, say, farm labor, for example, or agricultural labor otherwise, and they discount it as being unskilled, and because of that, not necessarily valuable. And it's interesting to, what your comments, just as a funny aside, made me think of this article in the New York Times about this urban couple that went to go and buy a farmhouse, and it came with 2 cows and 5 acres, and they immediately ended up selling it because they're like, I had no idea how hard this was to do this work. And it's like, that's not that much, but okay. So yes, there is a sort of assumption that, things that happen, in rural spaces, they don't necessarily take that much work. Maybe it's pretty easy. People aren't necessarily doing anything that important. And I think that that is a stigma that we've really got to fight against, especially if we want to retain people and bring them back, people who are interested in providing services, people who want to be attorneys, and bringing them back home, or perhaps even people like me who, I grew up around Los Angeles, got really interested in, rural studies and the like over time. But yeah, thank you so much. So, we've got 2 experts here today on policing, Doctors Boyd and Brown. And I think one of you mentioned at some point issues with regard to challenges in rural policing and cultural competencies and the like. So I'd love to hear more about that if you could.
a lot of the training that I do post George Floyd, and again, the murder of George Floyd was the line of demarcation for modern attitudes toward the police. And part of the problem that we have is we train the police in a particular way, and we haven't really changed the way we train policing in 110 years since the professionalism era. So the way that I started is with the African proverb that the history of the jungle is written from the perspective of the hunter. The lion doesn't get to tell his story because the lion is captured or the lion is killed or the lion has the hunter's knee on his neck for 10 minutes until he dies. If we want to reimagine policing, what happens if we start studying policing from the perspective of the community? Now put a pin in that for a second. Now, before we can talk about lawyers and courts, we understand that the police are the gatekeepers for the criminal justice system. How the police view you, how they interact with you is a predictor of negative consequences. So if we can get police officers to understand what's going on in Black and Brown communities, in First Nation communities, and BIPOC communities, if they get to normalize folks that are not like them and try to understand a little bit about what's going on, I think that's a pathway forward. And part of that is understanding community trauma, understanding vicarious trauma. And once they understand why we are the way we are, then we can move forward. And just to be completely blatant, America's been gaslighting Black people for 400 years. And they've been saying, well, we're going to forget about the 400 years of oppression, and we're going to forget about the 246 years of slavery. We're going to forget about slave codes and Black codes and Jim Crow and segregation, all of that. And today, moving forward, we're going to heal and we're going to be better. But the flip side of that is an event that recently happened in one day, September 11th, never forget. And the 2-day period that was the Alamo, remember the Alamo. And then a lot of people are hanging these Confederate flags and they're losing their mind when we take down these Confederate monuments. And my question is, since when did we erect monuments to the losing side? What is this, middle school soccer? That's not what we do. But yet, Black America, we should get over the 400 years of oppression and move forward. So we need to understand cultural competence at all levels. And I've got a colleague that he was the executive director of the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts, and he had all of the judges have a meeting in the community room in one of the projects. He says, you need to see how the people are living that you're sentencing. And then he says, you need to spend time at a prison to know when you send people here, what's going to happen to them. Because we have this esoteric view of law and the agents that carry out the law. But until they get a realistic understanding of the lives that people are living that are caught up in the system, until they understand that, we're never going to be able to move forward.
Thank you so much.
What he said pretty much covers it. I wholeheartedly agree. I would like to add, we need to keep in mind that policing is very much about the preservation of place. Police officers focus or are very sensitive to what they consider to be or what they're told to be is in place or out of place. If you or something is considered to be out of place, it or you will experience policing in a very different way. When we start to talk about we're well aware of how being in and out of place in urban areas and suburban areas can easily result in conflicts between the police and an individual they're encountering, someone in public. We also need to recognize, and I know we don't have unlimited time, we need to recognize the economics of policing as part of the economic engine of criminal justice. It starts with citations and the way some officers and some jurisdictions approach the revenue generating aspect of citations. There was a day when we had quotas. We supposedly do not have quotas or officers operating on quotas anymore. But regardless of a quota system, the fines that we see imposed through traffic violations, moving violations, and such, that generates revenue for a jurisdiction. When we bring that to courts, we are increasingly becoming aware, or rather, information is getting out that is more detailed and nuanced than ever about how our court systems create economic traps for people. Well, we need to recognize that a lot of jurisdictions operate based on the funds that they receive from doing justice, from enforcing the law. And those complex issues in urban centers, they become even more complex in rural areas where issues of poverty are very, very different. We need to talk about things like exposure rates. If you have to drive an hour on the road to get somewhere, you have a different type of exposure to a traffic stop than someone who has to drive 10 blocks or is choosing to drive 10 blocks or in an urban area. But we tend to not talk about that kind of stuff because there's so much to deal with to get down to that level, to get people to think about, wow, how might I be exposed to criminal justice issues in a region that's rural, more spread out? What does that mean for us, to me, as opposed to someone who's in a more densely populated urban area?
Thank you. And it brings to mind just an example that I've seen recently working on a paper. I've been reading through years of like the small towns minutes in rural Utah. And it's very apparent that their traffic stops are sort of the economic generator and like driver for the entire town. And the justice court judge in this town at some point actually would appear at town council meetings to give revenue updates. Like, this is how much money the court made. And it's like, wait, what? Like, are you, so I think that's a really important thing to think about. Okay, so how does this affect policing, especially when we know that the police are, of course, going to focus on anything that is out of place? What do we do about that? How do we try to remedy that? I know that we've been talking for a while about a lot of these challenges and everything, and things that are really difficult to deal with, and problems that might feel occasionally sort of intractable and hard to change. So I don't necessarily want to end this sort of panel discussion portion on sort of a doom and gloom note. I want to at least think of something that's positive for a bit. So what are some of the good things that you see about working in rural spaces for people of color and access to justice that might not even be something that you could replicate in an urban setting or something? What are things that give you hope, I guess? Yes,
I want this one first.
All yours, sir.
While it is still a controversial subject, I think that the response to the opioid crisis, particularly in non-urban centers, is promising in the sense that we are trying to embrace the utilization of medical and behavioral health systems, and doing so in a collaborative manner, in ways that we did not do with other drug epidemics. I'm hopeful that if our entire country can look at what we're seeing in some urban areas, particularly urban areas that are collaborating to bring up, to use services, if we can see that happen in more places, I think that that's a good thing.
Fantastic, thank you. Anyone else have anything to pitch in on this?
Much in the same way that I could argue that we over-police Black and brown bodies, we under-research rural communities. So whenever I do go into a non-urban setting, whether it's rural or even suburban, people tend to appreciate the level of interest there, and they tend to appreciate the resource that's coming in there. So for me, when I do research in an urban area, it's they're expecting it or tired of it. But when I spend time in rural settings, they seem happier about it than other places. And then I get to know people. And I often go from quantitative research to qualitative because I get to slow down and I get to hear stories and I get to actually see them as opposed to just work with them. So for me, it's always a pleasure to spend time in rural communities because it's not the hustle and bustle, the rip and run in urban type of research. I get to spend time getting to know folks and find out what truly are their problems, because a lot of times in urban areas, we get surface level, but when we spend more time with people, we get to the gist of the issue. We find out that crime is not the problem. Crime is symptomatic of larger problems. Then we get to spend time addressing those larger societal problems.
Professor Bridgman, is there anything that's easier, you think, about being in a rural jurisdiction?
I think in some ways, making change and being responsive and doing innovative things is easier. At least that's what I found. You know, we're doing some really innovative things with our juvenile court, in part response to our funding issues and also because we saw needs in our community. And we started having some of these conversations probably in October or November, and we have new programs that we're going to be ready to roll out with in the next month, right? Wholesale changes to our program. So we're able to bring together all of the stakeholders, have really good conversations. And I think because the kids that we talk about or the people that we're talking about with respect to all of these initiatives are our neighbors who we know. Some of them we've known forever, that we have many different connections with. I think it's a lot easier sometimes to get people to make change because we get to see that immediate impact with people that we know and that we care about. And so there are a lot of positives. You know, I work with a team of people who are so very dedicated to the kids that we help and so very open about different ways of approaching, you know, like you said, the opioid crisis or all these other things. You know, we are putting a coalition together right now across our state to see if there's ways that we can do access to justice better for our entire state. And that's bringing together our legislators, people from our state Supreme Court, people from our business community, you know, in ways that I think are a lot harder to do when you have a lot more people who are not as connected. So for me, those are really good, positive things.
Yeah, you know. Oh, sorry, please go ahead. I heard someone speaking and I didn't want to cut them off. So, you know, I was going to speak to just the scale of how much easier it is to accomplish things, I think. And I remember ages ago presenting a paper with regard to progressive prosecution in rural spaces and presenting it at the University of Maine at their symposium. And they had it at Colby College, I think, in the middle of the state. And it was really incredible because there were just attorneys that showed up from all of the state, like the whole state Supreme Court showed up. They were all excited to hear from us, you know, and it's like, okay, like Dr. Boyd was saying, people get really excited to work with you and to hear your ideas and to actually get feedback. You know, there might be sort of this stereotype, I think, out there with regard to rural spaces being closed-minded, but I was really overwhelmed by people coming up and telling me afterward, like, thank you, we need to hear these ideas. It's great to like be able to get some pushback on the way that we do things and, you know, get some outside critique about things. So I've found, you know, people in rural spaces to be a real joy to work with. They don't necessarily fall along really neat conservative versus liberal lines like Professor Bridgman was talking about earlier. And sometimes it's a lot easier just to get everyone together in one room and get things done if you're really determined to do it. So, you know, thanks to everyone for this fantastic discussion. I just wanted to open up to Q&A at this point. We've got 15 minutes for Q&A. I think we've got a couple of questions in the chat right now. But please feel free to send questions in the chat and we will get those answered the best we can. So the first question that we have here is, you know, from one of our attendees who asks, do you think a Teach for America type model might work for the rural practice of law targeted at recent and licensed attorneys? So something like Teach for America. Do you think that would be useful in rural spaces or not?
I think that could absolutely work, particularly if you have people have their loans forgiven after 10 years of working in rural communities. We need to incentivize people going back, and when we talk about resource, we don't necessarily mean pouring money into the community, but make it easier for people to have a living, to make a living in these rural communities. So I think that model could work wonderfully, if it's thought through.
I would say yes, because we use a similar model in some of our places. It's the VISTA program, I think is what it's called or whatever. But we get people for, it's only like a year or a couple of years, but a lot of these groups I work with and nonprofit legal providers use those recent graduates, certainly in these rural spaces. So absolutely, it's worked for us in a limited area. I think a more robust program would certainly work.
My law professor colleague at the University of South Dakota, Hannah Haxgard, actually wrote a really interesting paper a few years ago for that same Maine symposium, where she advocated that people who go into rural practice, because they're usually providing all kinds of services to their community, right? They might be criminal defense attorneys, but they're also helping with setting up, businesses or doing probate and other sorts of estate matters and the like, that their work should actually be counted as public interest work for purposes of loan repayment and loan forgiveness, without necessarily having to be in one of these programs. They should just be able to go to one of these like qualifying communities and have their loans forgiven, which I think is a really interesting solution, because as a small town practitioner myself, I really did do everything that comes through the door. Oftentimes doing it lo bono and everything, trying to just like help the community. And it was really hard because I could not write off that debt. I mean, I've paid it down now, but it's like, I'd be thrilled if all of our rural practitioners out there who wanted to get, our law students who wanted to be rural practitioners out there could get their loans forgiven for providing these essential services and greater access to justice to people in, especially people of color in rural settings. So I think it's a really interesting suggestion. I think it sort of parallels this other suggestion with regard to sort of a Teach for America model. And I'd love to see something like that happen. The next question that we have here is something with regard to what Dr. Boyd had mentioned with regard to brain drain. And what they ask is, are there opportunities like with teachers and social workers for recent graduates, something similar, that we know of with regard to working off law school debt? And I think, that question kind of ties into what we were talking about too. I do think that there are, that there is movement on doing that. I know that Illinois, like I was saying, is, trying to provide more of that sort of, loan forgiveness and other sorts of fellowship money as well. My understanding too is that Wisconsin is looking at doing something similar, but I'm not necessarily sure. So any other thoughts with regard to what we do about, better resourcing these attorneys who want to get out there and do this service for people? Okay.
I think we need to start early. To get to law school, you have to earn a bachelor's degree. We need to work on helping people figure out why they're going to law school in the first place, understanding their options. One of the things about the brain drain and the move to wanting to be work in a big city, I would argue that one of the most important or most significant competitor is the federal government when it comes to criminal justice students. And people want to get federal jobs, and they want to get federal jobs in urban areas. In this issue, we do not talk about federal circuits, and how the map is cut, and that there's a reality that even when it comes to the federal government, we need good people choosing to go to certain regions to work. So that's a whole nother dimension when it comes to criminal justice that unfortunately gets lost. And I think it gets lost in part because we do not educate or orient younger people to the issues so that they can understand, oh, I can pursue a career in the federal government and I can choose to work in areas that are not in urban centers. Or I can choose to work in a state and work in a rural area with a purpose of I'm going to a particular law school and I'm going to clerk for a particular judge or in a particular space so that I can build a career. Even if one wants to be entrepreneurial, I can build my own firm and I can build the firm that services certain areas or certain populations. But I think that we don't do enough to help folks understand the opportunities that are available, not just the challenges, but the opportunities that are available, because everybody's trying to eat at the same table. They're trying to go to the big, supposed big time.
I think that's very, very true. So thank you. There's another question for Dr. Brown here specifically, where you'd mentioned emphasizing bringing HBCUs into the conversation more, and someone in the audience was wondering if you could expand on that a bit more.
Definitely, and my colleague who we've worked at two HBCUs, the same HBCUs, Dr. Boyd can speak to this. HBCUs should be at the forefront of everything that we've talked about. If we are to be places that address justice, social justice, when you look at the distribution of HBCUs, where they're located, it's to me reprehensible that we're not doing more, that we do not have a course in this institution. And that's something that I'm in a position as a department chair to address. I address it with the full faculty. We make collective decisions, but I'm in a position to challenge my colleagues. Why are we not teaching about certain issues? I know throwing one more thing into the mix when we talk about rural areas, we need to think about environmental justice as we talk about social justice and how environmental justice issues are related to rural areas. There's so much that goes on that does not get discussed because we are dismissive of environmental justice. If we were to pay attention to environmental justice, we would have to recognize issues of rural justice. And whether we're preparing the next generation of students who would go on to work for some big firm defending a corporation, to we're training the next generation of students who are going to represent a single plaintiff or a small town in their efforts to address some sort of environmental issue. We just don't do it. And it's one more thing that we do not do. And it intersects so strongly with the population that we tend to serve, the students who we get and who earn degrees through us. So I really think that HBCUs need to holistically embrace rural justice as part of our mission, as part of addressing social justice.
Thank you. And we've got a few more minutes if anyone wanted to add more to that.
Let me just mention, we have specialty schools. The whole reason we have HBCUs is because many of us couldn't get into other schools back in the day. But if you wanted to go to college or to law school and specialize in civil rights, civil rights litigation, you're going to go to Howard University. Or if you want social justice and civil rights, you're going to go to the Thurgood Marshall School of Texas Southern. And, in the schools like Prairie View that specialize in juvenile justice, we have yet to develop the flavor for having rural justice as a specialty at a school. And I think once we start to market that, it's like Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I'm really grateful for that focus on HBCUs and the role that they could play in really advancing access to justice for people of color. If anyone has any other questions, we've got all of 2 minutes left, I think. But I think that I'm sure that everyone on this panel is happy to hear from anyone who's watching, I'm sure you could reach out to them with any other questions that you might have. I think that this is probably a good point at which to wrap things up. I'm so grateful to everyone for joining us. I'm grateful to everyone on this panel, Dr. Boyd, Professor Bridgman, Dr. Brown. This was fantastic. I've learned so much from each one of you, and it's just been a total honor to be able to moderate this panel with all of you. Thank you for taking the time. And again, thank you to the Deason Center for putting this together and sponsoring this lovely panel. Hopefully we get the chance to do it again soon, because I feel like there's so many things we could talk about all day long. So thank you.